Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carl Creasman. I'm professor of history at Valencia College on the East Campus, in the chair for the discipline over there. And we are in our Past Meets Present series. It's been my pleasure to work with the library for 5 years now, 6 years, no more, 7. Long time. And given these different lectures connected to history. And so we're very excited to partner with these. At the end, I'll show you a slide of kind of some where we're going to go and kind of connect our way forward. This year in particular, we're kind of engaging in, for maybe somewhat selfish reasons, an examination of research that I've been involved with narrowly for 3 years in finishing up a new degree, and a longer way for about 15 years kind of working through. I was just speaking with someone and they were referencing the book that I wrote in 2011 about how you can track crisis through a 500-year pattern, and you can see it. And in 2011, I had the audacity to say, well, we'll know by 2020 whether it happens or not. And the point of that research, I mean, starting then, even a little bit before that, even coming to now, is then to say to us, how do we kind of navigate? How do we figure out where to go forward? And today's episode, which is Past Meets Present, though, will sort of still lean into that research because, as I'm going to show you, there's a connection between what we think is true about the Enlightenment, what we've kind of believed to be true as a people in the West, perhaps more specifically, and what is factually or data-driven to be true, and they're two distinct things. And a key piece then leads us down the road of saying, if I plan on examining and assessing my now, I need to do so relative to facts and data and principles and concepts that are accurate, not inaccurate. If I think of them on a term that I wish it to be true, then it kind of leads us astray because we're trapped in the kind of the myth of what we want to be true. But I'm very much a realist when it comes to dealing with society and life. And so let's dive right in. As you know, turn this on, Carl. As you know, in 1789, we inaugurated our first president. That inauguration, you know, also is connected to the second iteration of our civic government. In that, you can look at the first government from 76 to this one in the 1780s, and then obviously into the first initial policies and decisions by the administrations of Washington and Adams, and then to some degree into Jefferson, as a conversation about how do we do government in a way that is sort of best for liberal or liberty individuals. If you happened to be here last month, and if you're not, you can watch it on YouTube. I'll show you that link again later. We talked about some of the unique aspects of our system, and one of those was that the system we were designing was only for individuals who had individual liberty. And in that liberty, then I can operate. But those founders still believed that they couldn't stand with Rousseau, who, as I'll show you in a moment, is much more in an anarchist view because we don't need any governance. They really were in kind of a Lockean position of we need something. So they're structuring that in that regard. And so that sets this thing up. But to understand how they got there, we have to remind ourselves that we're looking at the descendants of Europeans. We can't divorce ourselves from our European ancestry, because even as 1776 is going along, and there were some people who had third and even fourth generation at that point legacies back to some of the early colonists, people were still coming. And that will be a legacy for us, not to wade into any political waters, but we are a land of immigrants. Because from a European point of view, everybody kept coming over. So people are coming over both before we established the government and then into establishing and post the government in a sense of an expectation of how this government will work based on kind of philosophies and ideas that came to us from a European context. And in doing this, as we talked about multiple times in here, the founders were very deeply aware of the ancient background of these ideas. And so they were consciously being good students to think backwards, to say, if we're establishing a society that is based around a civic government, quote unquote, of the people, hey, that's been tried before. How did it work out? And of course, there were 2 iterations, and we talked about before. This is another place where I might say it's important for us to have our verbiage correct so we don't get trapped in our mythology. There's 2 iterations. Demos Kratos, we know that as democracy, or the Res Publica, we know that as republic. They are distinct systems. They're both under the umbrella of government of the people, and that's fair for us, but there's a distinction between them. It's vital for us as we think about terminologies that we're using them. So when they looked then at these ancient systems and then thought in terms of, hey, we're doing a new thing, this has come to be known as this victory of the rational mind that we call the Enlightenment. So what my aim is to do today, to somewhat take a stab off of Shakespeare, is to not come to bury the Enlightenment, but to see it in its proper context and understand in its proper context how then does the Enlightenment impact who we are. And you can kind of get this through a series of kind of questions that we're hoping to examine and kind of walk our way through over our time together. What does it even mean to say the Enlightenment? Is it something that stands independent, as it is often presented? Often it is presented a world of darkness, the lights came on, the Enlightenment, yay for those guys who told us really smart things. Is that accurate? Is that a way to go? What promises or expectations should we have based on what they were saying? And if there are now expectations or claims connected to the Enlightenment, and I promise we'll come back to Dr. King, about some arc of history, then is that factually true? Is there something that we can make claims? So we're going to dig into this whole process, setting it to some degree in reference point, excuse me, to the American story, seeing its influence on us, and then recognizing that today, if there were some promises about the Enlightenment, they've surely not come true. Or something's been done. Now that's the debate that I spend really time examining in the whole of my research, which is in that podcast that I've mentioned before. I'll show it to you here again in a second if you want to get there. But when we look at the promises, so the suggestion of the Enlightenment that the world is on an arc moving forward, and Dr. King didn't say this, but it's often, his quote is then taken to some degree out of context and implied, we're on an upward trajectory, meaning better. And then we see stats like this. You cannot in any shape or form say better has occurred. So what happened? And what I'm going to just go kind of give it away a little bit, I'm going to say the problem's not with the Enlightenment. The problem is with the mythology that was created around the Enlightenment that led to imprecise or incorrect expectations. Sort of like if you believe we're a democracy, and then you see votes happen and where 50+1 takes the lead, but then that's not enacted as law, you might say, I am so frustrated because we were screwed. But if I tell you, but we're not a democracy, then you're like, oh, so then I shouldn't expect 50+1. Exactly, you should never expect 50+1 because that's got nothing to do with it because we're not a democracy. We could choose to become one. I'm not saying we shouldn't. If you want that to be the case, by all means, you're a citizen. Start your movement now to rewrite the Constitution so that we can become one. But don't have the Constitution that we have and then make the claim we are a democracy, because all you're going to do is set out incorrect expectations that then lead to frustration. These stats are not the only one. And those of you, again, I've said this before, as a professor, this kind of is a genesis of where I really focused in the past 4 or 5 years, because I heard from so many students that they were experiencing this emotional distress. But the emotional distress also kind of goes into a whole plethora of places that we've looked at. In fact, I was just listening to an expert today, so I added, if you've seen this slide before, I added this one thing here. Today, 38% of our children 12 to 8 years old are pre-diabetic. It used to be 0. It ought to be 0. Something has happened in a variety of arenas that then lead people to a sense of frustration because of their expectations around the Enlightenment. Well, and again, it's sort of like, well, what are some of those expectations? Well, again, that things should be kind of moving forward, constantly improving. That they're not have led us to disillusionment, which we're going to come back to that word later, because that's kind of a key word for how we can then discern how do I go forward. Often, at the core of this issue is the question of improved things through science. So again, so a joke I heard one professor say, like if you go back in time, when would you go? And he said, nowhere before they had penicillin. And if you're smart, you're like, yeah, I agree with that, right? We live in a time with, in broad terms, far better medical technology and science and knowledge, which has been, I think fair to say, beneficial to us. There are arguments with that. However, I just listed some things as an example for you to recognize that the conclusion is not as obvious as you might think, even in the realm of science. Because when you contemplate our planet and our world in 2025, and having just mentioned science in the sense of our health, one thing we might all think is, I get to live longer. Well, so far what we've found out is that living longer is not necessarily better. And there are many humans in their 8th or 9th decade who kind of wish they weren't here because of health outcomes to them and their living experience. And so that's raises all kinds of social questions that we've been grappling with. Certainly, we all are very familiar with Dr. Kevorkian, but that whole kind of moral discussion, to some degree, is working off of what does the Enlightenment give us? What should it give us? I've said here before, I'm somebody who doesn't really want to give up his air conditioning. And I drove here today. And so I like having my combustion engines. And at the same time that we might tout these as improvements of our society and of our life, a fair reading of those would at least say, maybe it's not as clear as we think, depending on how you view things relative to the planet. So I'll just leave that alone for there, but just to point out for us, what are our expectations is critical for us to have a review of kind of where the Enlightenment takes us. When you add in kind of what the 20th century looked like, the Enlightenment should have suggested some version of maybe a near utopia. And yet what we found in the 20th century is that it is the bloodiest century, and I don't have the numbers in my head fast enough, but I arguably believe, well, I'll say this for confidence, more people died in the 20th century than in the 900 years leading into the 20th century. And so this is the enlightened century, and taking the wars away and just looking at the human experience in a whole variety of places that were led by different leaders who were claiming the Enlightenment-based concepts. It's been a bloody century. So then we could say to ourselves, well, wait a minute, how did that happen? Because these people, a variety of the leaders you might can think of, would tell you they were operating off of kind of enlightened concepts that then led them down the road to what most would say to barbaric ends. So that's that debate that we're kind of wrestling with. And so all of that then is kind of my research, my focus, and what I like doing here, no matter what we're talking about. So when we talk about Waterloo in a couple of months, and we're doing that in reference to the year of Jane Austen here at the library, I want you to know more about Waterloo and find out aspects about Napoleon and kind of what led to that moment that you may not know, because those kind of give us a deeper comprehension of the situation. And in this case, as we're trying to solve this problem of, my way of saying it, a nation adrift, like a boat at sea with no rudder, no guide, just unmoored and now in the middle of heavy waves, we've got to figure out how we're going to go. And my contention is we will get that through a study of history. So again, here's that podcast that I put that together and kind of explaining how do we get there, and it kind of look through these kinds of moments. So let's back up and get all the way back into antiquity to make sure we understand where the Americans were coming, how we understand this concept of the Enlightenment. So, when you go back, you kind of realize that they were trying to marry and put together this idea, both I think subconsciously but consciously, how can we connect two things that they held vital that the Enlightenment generally worked, particularly as we're taught it, to separate. And it's most famously to us when Jefferson makes his phrase in the Declaration, he, Adams, and Franklin, that we're leaning on the laws of nature, so that's the Enlightenment, and the scientific revolution, and the information given to us from our rational minds, and nature's God, which for them was Christianity. And so how do we have the kind of a blend in trying to find a way to construct a society to kind of bring in this new world that we can find? They again looked back in history, and one of the things that they were very well aware of is that it's very difficult to hold a system of government of the people. And so they knew they needed to construct societies that could inform in a way that how we could move our direction forward. In other words, have the people be enlightened enough and on a moral virtue foundation so that they can then make good laws and decisions that are allow for a flourishing broadly for the everyone. And that's their general kind of target of where they're trying to go. However, when they look in history, they noted something, that there's this allure to power, which always is a problem in every society. So again, just as I say that, I'm thinking to myself, that's a great example of how the promises that we're told the Enlightenment suggested are not possible, meaning we haven't arrived at some place where the human suddenly is so altruistic. Once they're in power, they're never attracted to more power. In other words, what we believe is what Lord Acton said, is that power corrupts. Nobody's immune from this, of having the potential once you're in power. And you know this from being on HOAs, city boards, the Girl Scout groups. People who get power can be immediately attracted to having more of that power. And again, Lord Acton, that power corrupts. So this is the point. What happened to the Athenians and to the Romans is they basically lost their way through internal and external. I was thinking as I was preparing this, we need to go back. I've done it once here. We need to probably go back and do this again. Like what happened to Rome and what happened to Athens? It might be instructive for us. But the short version is both internal and external. And I would say the internal was more damaging than the external. So that would take a lot to explain for you. And so what happened in both those cases is this that you've seen before, if you've been here before, what I call the power pyramid. This is the historic norm. This is what the species does. These things, I'll go back, these guys are democracy and a republic. That's weird. The government of the people idea is weird. So whatever continent we're on, whatever time period we're talking about, this is the norm. Single leader, almost always a male. In smaller settings, a tribal leader, like a grandfather or a father, but there's somebody in charge. Then there's a small, imagine the guy in charge having two brothers or having an older uncle and a nephew. Somebody close to power because they're in the family lineage, and then the rest of us. And you get no say-so and no involvement. And so when you see the collapse in Rome and in Athens, what you see is this one brief moment in time when there was this attempt at government of the people collapse back to the norm. Now, whether you and I like this or not is not the point. I would just point out for you again, here's another place, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, I realize. If you can understand this, then you can understand the last at least 30 years in our nation, if not 70 years. And just, I won't use any current names. Think of the adulation and hero, if not idol worship, of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And how nobody balked at him staying president for a prolonged period of time. When we knew power corrupts, but we did it anyway. Why? Short answer, because we actually, as a species, we like this. Freud would suggest there's a parental thing going on or a daddy thing going on. That's a road we're not going to go down, but I think it's provable in that we like it this way. So then if today, or if 2 months ago, you were concerned about whoever was in leadership or your fellow Americans seeming to lean into just having somebody do this, say to yourself, I'm not surprised. And if you look back, I would suggest with each of our presidents all the way back to Ronald Reagan, you will find that same hero idol adulation that suggests we really want this. So what I'm saying is you and I should not be surprised, and then we should say, but wait, why do people act so shocked? Well, the short answer, they act shocked because of the Enlightenment. Because the Enlightenment suggested we would never go there. And then you should say, okay, either the facts are wrong, because it's not Democrats, it's not Republicans, it's not liberals, it's not conservatives, it's all of us. So that explains a lie. So the facts are wrong, well, they're clearly not wrong. Then my expectations from this moment are wrong. And I have to own that. And not to say, again, we're not here to bury the Enlightenment, but to say, oh, maybe the Enlightenment did something else, but things that I was told that it meant are not true. That's kind of what we're digging into. However, things that were lost, as Tolkien told us with The Lord of the Rings, gets found. And so, roughly 1,000 years in Western society history goes by, and all of a sudden, just like we've seen, if we've ever gone to the beach for a sunrise, the dark day begins to warm and light begins to break. And this is this thing known as the Renaissance. It starts for us in the Italian peninsulas. Cities begin to be restored. And the Renaissance, what I call a revolution of revolutions, emerges. And everything in society that was known had upheaval. Mostly for the good. So this may be almost, I could say, my key points. I may say more than once. The Renaissance is what we really need to examine, not the Enlightenment. Because the Enlightenment is merely a culmination of the Renaissance. So the first question I pose that we might think of is, did the Enlightenment kind of emerge ex nihilo? Boom! No. The light had begun 400 years before in the late 1300s. And certainly by the 1500s was bright as the noonday sun. And you see that particularly in the big ones that you probably look at this list go, oh, I know that one. The scientific revolution and the religious revolution, which gets its sexy little name, the Reformation. And all these things were giving us a concept that we generally call humanism. And what is humanism? Well, when I teach ancient society history for my students, I try to help them frame why we're in this class that's covering 5,500 years of seemingly old dead people who maybe doesn't have anything to do with me. And we talk about it by understanding the world today is a Western world. Whether you like it or not, it's a Western world. Just look at the hand-wringing about a variety of human rights issues in cultures who've never had those as values for them that are being imposed on them. We would say for the good. You should teach all your women. You should let them go to school as a father of 3 daughters. I champion that, right? So when you're looking then at these things, how then does that happen? And it happens by starting with a foundation. As you build any house or edifice, there's a foundation. And in the foundation of what we call Western value or Western society lie these 3 things. The idea of the mind, the idea of a civic society founded on law, we would say government of the people, and the idea of the value of all people. Yes, on all 3 of these, you might could contend with me and say, wait a minute, I know of a place in so-and-so at such and such a time, and they did those things too, and we could talk about those. And in some cases, I would say, yes, I understand your point, but when you look at the legacy of the Western society, those 3 things give us these unique moments in time. So again, back to democracy and republic. It's not the Athenians and their democracy. Nobody reads Clisthenes' law. Everybody knew the Roman set of laws that were preserved by Justinian. So it's the Roman idea of civic structure that has the legacy. Yes, there are other philosophers, but it was Plato, as one scholar said, all other philosophy, particularly in the West, is merely footnotes to Plato. And it was the Christians. You say, but wait, I know people in other societies, they valued people, they valued their own people. And in many cases, they didn't value all of those people. And then here come these weirdos who said this belief structure is open to everybody. of any system that was unique. So the idea of the human, all these got lost by the 400s. And for that thousand-year moment was gone. And the Renaissance is a recovery of all of these. You may have heard of the phrase Neoplatonic, Neo-Aristotelian, the Reformation. What are these things? What's the scientific revolution? They're all going back to this moment and saying, wait a minute, there's something of use here. Let's re-examine it now. And in varieties of ways, re-express it. So that's what the Renaissance is, and that's going to lead us on our way to the Enlightenment. This gives us the chance then to kind of get a running start into the Enlightenment. And again, answering the question of, well, did these guys just, did Voltaire first write, and then that was the first dawning of new light? And so you see immediately, no, this guy's way before that. Well, we don't have time to give each of these scholars the depth every one of the scholars I'm going to show you here in a slide could take a whole hour and a half explanation by people smarter than myself in some cases being able to present this. Francis Bacon, he's the one who gives us the idea of the inductive method, which is kind of bridging the science, what we call the scientific method. But just think about scientists, what did they start to do? They started to observe, and they had things like telescopes and microscopes that gave them new abilities to observe. And then in observing, you then can come out of that and raise conclusions. Following right after him is obviously Descartes. He's considered the father of modern philosophy. Descartes goes the other direction. He deduces, kind of gives us the deductive method. And there's a much longer conversation here about what he was trying to prove, but basically he's saying, what can I know to be a fact? And from that then go to a broader understanding. Hence when you read Discourse on Method, what he's really working his way through is, can we know anything? And then ultimately he gets to the very end. It's almost like he goes down into a valley in which at the bottom of it, he recognizes that I am observing myself. I am thinking in third person, external to the body, this being. And if I can do that, then I'm not doubting that I'm doing that. I think, therefore I am, meaning I exist. And from that deduction, he then climbs the other direction to prove truth about a whole variety of things, ultimately ending up with God. Now, in this time period of the 15 and 1600s, moving into the 17th century here, 1600s, while Europe is embroiled in a series of wars about power, often poorly explained as religious wars or wars of religion, England, while it has had its own Reformation moment, has basically settled things by the time of Queen Elizabeth at the end of the 1500s, so that its 1600s are different. And in that time of the 1600s then, what the British are able to do is continue this examination started by Bacon and Descartes. Think again what's happening. What's happening is the question is being raised, if we believe the human has the ability to process, the Greeks, and has the ability to then construct something, the Romans, and construct something so that everybody can flourish, the Christians, if we can do that, if we can bring this ancient idea forward to, well, what would that look like? And Bacon, to a lesser degree, Descartes, not quite as much, are asking those kind of civic questions that then the crisis of the 17th century for England brings forward both Hobbes and Locke, who we've talked about multiple times if you've been here with me. They are, to me, arguably the most central figures you have to understand if you wish to grasp the last 350 some odd years of Western history, particularly from within the United States. They are the yin and yang, the plus, the minus, the poles, in which everything else centers within. And it is to my contention that when you examine even current day political decisions, what you're seeing is a wrestling match between Locke and Hobbes. And you can imagine this, as I said before, imagine you're playing the video game, you get the God mode, and you're now in charge of a civic structure, and you've got a plus minus, you can move the lever where you want it. Are you going to move it to where Locke is, or are you going to move it to where Hobbes is? Where would you put the governing point? And it's connected always to power. How much power would you give the central government, whether that's of your small city or of a large, gigantic empire? How much power do you wish to give them? And that's you moving between Hobbes and Locke. it all references back to their view of the human, which all these Enlightenment thinkers are starting in the same place. If we're going to say humanism is true and valuable, the human has value, from then, how do I then judge the ability of these humans to then construct such a system? As you can see, for Hobbes, and he's the first to use this phrase social contract, which Rousseau gets so much credit for later, a century later, but he's the first to say it. How do we do it? Well, the human, to Hobbes, not quite that good, and if so, we have to find a way to end any strife. How do we end any strife? For Hobbes, it's by having a centralized, powerful figure that he calls the Leviathan, who then causes strife to end because you're afraid of it. So you then will not act outside of the bounds, even if your natural senses are. I want that, so I think I want to take that. I need that, I'm going to do that because of my liberty, which Hobbes affirms. He's like, but your liberty and somebody else's liberty typically are going to butt heads, so we don't need that. How do we solve that? And so he's thinking in those terms to go down that way. Well, in between Hobbes and Locke occurs the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution, to some degree, you could say, is a repudiation of Hobbes, because the British will end up in this place where they will affirm that we can limit the power of the central government, in particular, limit the idea of the monarch, who up to that point had hands on all the levers of power there be. One way that they're limiting the monarch is by divorcing or dividing power away from him and giving it to another agency, which, as you know, becomes the parliament. Now, there had been a parliament, but this, again, another way to look at the battle for the British is that it's a battle, as I put on one of the slides, between the parliament and the king as who would decide things, and see the parliament as an expression of the citizens. So government of the people or government not of the people. How are we going to kind of work that out? And so they create a Declaration of Rights. Now again, I show you this because this is predating anything that typically is brought up relative. The Enlightenment believes these things. And it predates the United States, which often, if you're thinking in civic terms and you say, what's the Enlightenment? You say, oh, well, the American Revolution, so late 18th century. That's this, the Enlightenment thinkers thought these great things, then the Americans did that thing based on what they thought. And now you and I are saying, oh, no, these ideas come from England a century before, so they're kind of expressing these different views. And some of these you'll recognize as ones we carried forward into our Constitution, which of course leads us to Locke. So Locke kind of takes us into this place where we are noting when he takes the opposite viewpoint of Hobbes. Hobbes says the human can't self-control because they are always self-focused. Locke's like, no, the human can and is generally morally good. There's a few ne'er-do-wells, so we still need some government, but the government needs extraordinarily limited power. And again, to help you understand Locke and Hobbes, back to the video game, don't think about how you're thinking in terms of what you like. Don't think about it in terms of what you think would be even more successful in the world of competition with other nations. Think strictly about how much power do you want to give the government that then decides and enacts the rules. That's the question. If you say government of the people, you're giving the government very, very little power because the power resides with the people. And then we'll make rules as we feel like it. But we are the ones making rules. Its government is us. If you're on the other side, moving the lever over because you feel that too much chaos will occur because individuals will kind of act out, and you don't really believe, Locke, that there's only a few of them, then you're going to want the government to have power to make rules irrespective of what the people want. Because like your dad made rules for you and not asking your opinion, he and your mom just made rules because they thought this is best. Nobody asked for your vote. Parental experience is an example of a Hobbesian setting because you're not asking the people, which is the children, what they think. You're just doing it because you know best. The problem with that, obviously, is as citizens and as voters, we're all adults too. So then you're kind of like, wait, what do you think you know best? You may not even be older than I am. How do you think you know best? That, you can see where the problem begins to lie. But as you're moving the video game, now in your mind, maybe some game you actually play, you have to think, do I believe the people can kind of self-moderate themselves and make decisions for themselves on a variety of levels? Then I'm going to have very limited power for my central government. If you say, I don't believe that would happen, I think chaos would happen and death and murder, that's the Hobbesian position. Then you'd move it the other direction. Does that make sense for everybody? Just want to be able to get it. I'm not asking what you like. I just want you to be able to kind of get where they're coming from. So Locke, when he writes in his two treatises, the first treatise is really kind of a repudiation of Hobbes. Second treatise is kind of laying out, well, what do I think? And he kind of lays out what I just said for you, basically, that there is this way to establish a civic society with limited government. He's not anti-king, so don't say Locke is somehow anti-monarch because he believed in a monarchy, but the king in parliament was the phrase they would have used, meaning the king's power is sort of subsumed into parliament, who is the dominant player in the story. So then these four, Bacon, Descartes, Hobbes, and Locke, really kind of show us that this movement through the Renaissance is what's leading us to the Enlightenment. Which, by the way, that could raise questions in your mind if someone has taught you the Enlightenment as a singular moment, kind of ex nihilo. What did they not like about these guys? Why would they divorce it from its historical context? That's a different conversation. In any case, while the British are doing this, the continuation on the continent is this setup of the power pyramid, which we then begin using a term like absolutism. And I've often wrestled with this because the idea is Louis XIV in particular gains the most amount of power known in a governing system at that time. And then we say, so he elevates this concept of absolutism. And he does, but at the same time, there are multiple places on the planet before Louis, going backwards, where other individuals had the same amount of kind of overriding dominant power. So it's just an interesting way of thinking about, is it really a fair comparison? It perhaps undercuts what the British are doing by saying there's kind of this comparison between the British constitutionalism and the French absolutism, because the French are just doing what everybody does. And Louis just happened to get to the pinnacle of that, but he's not alone, as you can see. So this takes us to the idea of the Enlightenment. So when we talk about this, one thing I've tried to point out already is that it is standing on the shoulders or the foundation of the Renaissance. It cannot be understood any other way, as I've tried to demonstrate to you. What is it believing? It's believing it's approaching these ideas. In essence, these two are the problem, and these, which you again can sort of see, law, there's the Romans, reason, they're the Greeks, human dignity, that's the Christians, what they offered in the foundation, that these three help provide us the solution to dealing with those situations. And they fall in two categories, the Enlightenment thinkers, those on the continent, those up in Scotland, which we'll come back to in a second. Now, there is usually a nod to Locke in this idea of this Holy Trinity who helps us understand what the Enlightenment is. I'm just trying to broaden it out for you by giving you a deeper look at the idea of where they're getting at. So the Enlightenment is often connected to the political concept of liberalism, and liberalism as an idea is a child of Locke, because it's kind of this embracing of the liberty of the individual. That's the idea of the process, which just in that phrase alone, what we call liberalism today has divorced itself from its historic moorings. Might be a useful term, but it's not at all what it used to mean in the process. A couple of the things that are useful to kind of point out to us. One is this, that as now you've gained this growth of the printing press since the 1550s, 1540s, it's 1400s. As you've got this happening, moving in there, you start to have more and more literacy. And that's a good thing. It's kind of an allusion to what the Renaissance provides for us, which the Enlightenment kind of highlights and emphasizes, and that is education is a vital aspect of producing a better society or a more informed society. And so you begin to have all across Europe in particular, these, we would call them coffee shops, they call them salons, where people would gather and chat and read and talk to each other and tell each other about various and sundry different things. And ultimately, as this is moving forward, so again, keep in mind, on the continent, you've got this expression of the old system of the power pyramid in what we call absolutism. And now you begin to have writers taking their lead from Britain, from England, kind of moving their way down, saying, wait a minute, we can challenge this through reason, through our minds. We can kind of try to find a way to restrict the power of a monarch, and in their minds, the monarch's aiding and abetting power of religion. We can restrict these things. As we do that, it'll lead us to a better world. And so that leads us to some degree this set of ideas. You can kind of read this top to bottom as a growing hypothesis that if this, then that. All the way down to we can have continued human improvement with no limits, and goodness, truth, whatever word you want to go with, will reign supreme. In other words, we'll end up in a utopia that will always be good, because the human as species will have been developed over time in its improvement. Does that make sense for everybody? It's really important to kind of get this, because this is kind of the beginning of where we need to start asking questions. We won't do it yet. We've got to look at some more thinkers. But we begin asking questions about these implications. And you can see it's all kind of connected into things like the pursuit of more knowledge in science, which is a positive good, at least in Carl's mind. That then we can discover things about the world, which again, a positive good, at least in Carl's mind. But then it gets extrapolated out to say, if we can discover things, maybe we can discover things that are more intangible, like moral rules, that we can then apply sans religion. We won't need any force telling us about rules for individuals of how to live. We can just do it on our own, because we will have discovered these scientific rules about morals and morality. That's kind of the direction that they're going in. Now, again, where is it happening? The continent. And what's often, again, if I had told you who we're going to talk about here, most of you would have given me some of these names on the top line. Very few of you would have given me names on this second line. And from an American point of view, these are the ones that matter. These, not so much. They're useful, but they're not as crucial as these guys. It's interesting when you compare, say, the continental Enlightenment figures and the Scottish Enlightenment figures, because there are some key differences about their perceptions, about how they approach things. You can see these kind of displayed up there, but at the center of it, and I've said this before, we're talking about any matters of spirit and faith, it kind of gets uncomfortable for people because we are afraid of it. And as I said last month, if we want to try to find a solution for where we are as a society, we can no longer be afraid of this conversation or this topic, because our founders were not. And we have to be brave enough to step into that to say, okay, what does this mean? And an aspect of the continental Enlightenment was, as I said, sort of a rejection of religion, and in particular, this idea of religion being in kind of league with absolutism. It's not an unfair observation that they're making. Hey, we look at England, they have people voting for things. Only a few, but still, and I'm here, and we don't get to vote for nothing. And they've got a king or a parliament that's sort of in charge, and I'm here, and all we have is this absolute monarch. Why do we have that? And it is correct to then look at things like the influence of a variety of what we would call state church. However, it's important to also understand the Scots and those in England before the Union occurs and then after the Union occurs, they have a state religion also. So the Scots somehow found a more easy comfort of connecting the faith idea of how humans can operate together and the civic idea, or kind of the natural world idea. So let's kind of dig into these. All right, so let's start with the first one. Voltaire, I mean, I say he's the one everybody usually goes to. He's the one people think of first. I'll remind you again, I'll say it, every one of these slides I'm about to show you could easily have a solid hour-and-a-half conversation just about them. These are brilliant people who have a variety of viewpoints that offer a lot to us, and we're not going to slow down to go into the depth of who they are, but that they're necessary for us to kind of grasp. When we say, what is the Enlightenment? This is what we're talking about. Again, these guys are all standing on the shoulders of giants. They're on Bacon's shoulders and Descartes' shoulders, and obviously from a scientific point of view, they're on Copernicus and Galileo and Newton. Remember on the thing slide I've showed you before, Newton's part of the Holy Trinity. He's kind of held up as kind of this key figure of understanding the Enlightenment, the success of the human's rise into authority. So Voltaire, he's very critical of France, and he's kind of just writing out. He's more famously known, and it's not on the slide, for Candide than he is for Letters on the English Nation. But the Letters on the English Nation kind of is his foray into, we need to make some changes of how we approach things, how we kind of look into things. He's really perhaps most famous for being first of kind of coming out and writing in a way that is critical of the government at a time in France that would be somewhat dangerous to be critical of the government. He's followed up by Montesquieu. Montesquieu perhaps is a little more famous for us, or familiar for us from a sense of what it relates to the American story, because of the connection of division of power, which John Adams kind of led us into. So you can kind of almost put Adams as a student of Montesquieu, and Adams expressing in an American context Montesquieu's position. For Montesquieu, the idea of power exists in a pie or a circle. You have to divide it, and you have to divide the power that exists in more than one way, so that there's no bridging of the gap, which leads us often, as we've seen it, into moments when the decision-making process that happens in such a system is laborious and slow. And then you can often feel like, well, nothing gets done. To which Locke would say, and most of the Enlightenment figures would say, Montesquieu would certainly say, that's good. That's kind of the point. Because if nothing's being done by the government, I have the time, space, and freedom to express my liberty, to go do what I want to do without having to stop to do what you want me to do. Does that make sense for everybody? Can you see that? I'm on a hiring committee, and so I have to do a thing for my HR so I can do it. So this afternoon, I got to spend about an hour doing a thing. It's not what I want to do, but the power over me, as long as I want to be on this committee, says you got to. You don't have to do it this afternoon if you don't want to, but you got to do it at some point. So I have to take time. So the government, using the term loosely for my boss, but the government has the power to say, you must do this. In Montesquieu's mind, maybe that should have been a divided decision, and maybe some other aspect would have said, well, we don't really think you need to do that, so they would have a battle over it, and I get my Saturday free. Because I'm not being imposed on by government to do something. Does that make sense for everybody? So Montesquieu's kind of walking us down there, and his book, Spirit of the Laws, is really the one that kind of walks this whole thing out. Again, this idea that by giving power, if you say, how much, remember the question, Locke and Hobbes, how much power? Now you're playing the video game, and you've given the power to however much, whether your circle's small or whether you made it large. Now he would say, great, now you have to divide it. You have to structure it in such a way that part of your circle is controlled by her, and part of your circle is controlled by him, and this other third or fourth or fifth is controlled, and then however well you want to divide it. For Montesquieu and later for Adams, that's a strength to the system to do what? To be effective in getting things done? No, to protect your liberty in the civic setting. That's kind of always where they're going. They're opposed to unchecked power in the process. Then we get to Rousseau, who's perhaps the most famous and I think the most misunderstood. Rousseau is the one who battles the most with all the others. He's so radical that even people like Voltaire and Montesquieu, I won't say they don't like him, but they differ with him deeply, and they express their difference. And at times he finds himself really out there kind of all by himself. Here's his book, Social Contract. One of the things that's most interesting for Rousseau is where he lays the problem. If Hobbes and Locke to some degree lay the problem at the issue of power, he would say, yes, but what I mean is the problem is property. So if you ever hear anybody talking about kind of governing philosophies and they marry Locke and Rousseau as if they're saying the same thing versus Hobbes, that person does not know Rousseau. Because Rousseau rejects Locke, because for Locke, one of the central promises that you're given as a human being from God is your right to property. And Rousseau's like, property is the chief ill. Marx will, to some degree, take all of his work from Rousseau's standing point. Not in a direct, like he read Rousseau and said, I'm going to write Das Kapital, but it's that idea of kind of how he moved forward. All property does bring in an inequitous situation that needs to be solved, the only way to solve it is nobody gets any property, or in Marx's supposed ideas, everybody gets the same amount of property. So Rousseau takes this and kind of walks on into it, and he really is the first to say, you don't need a central figure at the top. Now, again, as I said earlier, for Rousseau, when I read Social Contract, I see him positing an anarchist position. And as I've said other times, for me, names of systems, fascism, monarchy, empire, democracy, you need to keep those amoral. They're just words, just terms describing possible solutions. Then what you can do as a historian, which you're all here to be one, is you can then say, well, what's the evidence of that system? Has it been tried before? How did it work out? But anarchy is just one of the various terms and possible systems. So for Rousseau, because people are chiefly good, he agrees with Locke on that. And if you then follow through with no property, then you need no rules at all, no centralized anything in which to congeal any power. The individual would maintain her power fully and never give it over. Remember, Locke argues in the state of nature, it's inconvenient, and there are still some people who might do bad. So you make the compromise to move out of the state of nature and give away some of your power to the civic structure. Does that make sense? Rousseau's like, you don't need to do that. That's crazy. It's crazy talk. Now, in the end, he concedes that there's a problem or it's a difficulty in getting there, I think mostly because he recognizes, I don't care who's saying it, nobody's ever going to eliminate people's personal property. So to suggest civic structures where there's no property owned by anybody runs into fault lines almost immediately. So he concedes, but doesn't concede on don't construct a system with a king. He's like, we still don't need the power pyramid. We'll just have, like the Athenians, democracy. And remember, in a democracy, all the citizens get to speak to or vote on or decide about all the issues all the time. If there's any decision being made by anybody else, that's not what the Athenians set up. So don't call it democracy. All the citizens vote, talk to, speak to, all the issues, all the time. And that's where Rousseau wanted to go. His chief critic is Mary Wollstonecraft. And she's a wonderful woman to study, particularly if you enjoy learning about the many women who were vital to our success as a human species in their thinking, in their ability, in their leadership, and are often marginalized in our materials. And she was critical of Rousseau because for all of his proclamations about the human and the value, he was as sexist as the day was long. And so you almost get an appendage at the end. He meant, oh, but of course I don't mean any women in any of this. That's not what he wrote, but you get the impression. And so she calls him on the carpet for it and raises some key issues. She's not the first feminist by any stretch, but she's one of the key voices, particularly related to the Enlightenment, who gets here, and that she's kind of walking through things that I hope you all would say, oh, I know that are instinctively, but people did not believe that then, and maybe some don't believe it now. That women have the same innate capacity for reason, that virtue is the same thing for men and women, which is why it's the humans, and that there needs to be equality in how we kind of relate to one another. So there's your key Europeans. Obviously, I didn't mention Kant. I didn't show you one from Middleton. There's other thinkers and writers who are in the process. These are your key thinkers. But what about what's going on in Scotland? Because that's what's more important for the American side. It has a deeper influence. And that leads us to Francis Hutchinson. Hutchinson is really the father of the Scottish Enlightenment. So he's kind of partnered with Voltaire in a sense of the first one to be writing. In the Scottish story, and you may know Scotland yourself, Edinburgh and Glasgow, they're kind of like the key 2 points in the Scottish Enlightenment. Aberdeen up at the top is sort of the triangle of Scottish Enlightened thinking, and he is a professor at the University of Glasgow. And he was influenced by the same person who influenced Locke. So Locke was connected to Shaftesbury before, at the end of, leading into the Glorious Revolution. So Hutchinson reads Shaftesbury and is also influenced by his thinking. And so he basically posits a whole series of writings that is addressing this immoral philosophy, which you could simplify it. He's kind of in league with Locke. He's answering Hobbes, and his position is really one that's sort of suggesting the human and their happiness, although that can be too trite of a word for many of us, but the person's individual sense of contentment maybe is at the center of kind of public calm. That we want to foster that and believe that you can build there. So you can see he's kind of opposed to slavery, because you can't claim that there's society open for all if you have some people involved in slavery. You can't say society's equitable for all if you have a group, half of your people who are not included kind of in the story. And this sort of doctrine of happiness kind of carries him forward. Well, just like Locke and Hobbes are kind of poles, when you look at the Scottish Enlightenment, Hutchinson's kind of matched by Lord Combe. So Henry Home, he's the second father, he's in Edinburgh, and in his viewpoint, he's a jurist, he's a judge. So he's now going to go much more down the road of structure involving law and how we organize law, and he looks first back into history to kind of understand how can we navigate a society, how do we structure a society to do well. Again, remember, he and Hutchinson are writing in the legacy of the Glorious Revolution, so in the first decades after that's all happened, meaning it's still in a process being worked out by the British as far as like, what would be the right thing to do and how to do it. So he's like, hey, look, we got to make sure we're keeping law in the process. If we don't have law and structure, one of the things I teach my students when you're observing human history is you look to see what is the status of law. And so we start that in antiquity by looking at, say, Hammurabi's Code, which was put on big, gigantic, 7-8 foot high rocks all over. And what I tell the students is as we're going along, pay attention to when the law is written and obvious and when it's unwritten and unclear. And what you'll see consistently is where the law is written, even if you and I think it's a little over the top, where it's written, society is much more prosperous and successful for the individual than in the societies where it's unwritten. And from that, one might posit in our own day, I don't know about you, but I don't think I know any of the laws of our country. And when I hear my lawgivers saying, oh yeah, that 20,000 pages, I didn't read it. I voted on it, but I didn't read it. Begins to make me wonder, while our law may be technically written and we could all Google it, if it's so obtuse and so deep and so thick, it's unreadable, then it's as if it wasn't a law, which then means I don't know where the laws are, which then means individual liberty, freedom, the ability to express ourselves, or to have a flourishing society falls apart. Maybe worthwhile considering. So anyway, he's, again, you can see Keynes as opposed to Hutchinson. His kind of magnum opus is this book, Sketches on the History of Man, and he basically expresses his viewpoint of how, again, looking just like Rousseau did, just like Hobbes did, let's go back in history and come out of that and say, how has human society structured itself to develop where we end up? And he's got a four-phase theory, which once you get to the society that he lives in and has been all of our societies since that time period, we realize it's at the fourth phase, and it demands a kind of complexity that is challenging to build and challenging to hold on to, but his argument is you have to. Now, they're followed by two students who are worth us looking at. David Hume is one of them. He's probably the one major Scottish Enlightenment person who isn't in any way trying to celebrate or marry Christianity into the story. So he's kind of saying we don't have to think down that way. You can see that he had he was a student of Lord Combe, and his writing here, Treatise of Human Nature. So again, you get this idea they're always writing about human nature. He kind of is siding with Hobbes that look, the human by themselves, it's a struggle. The human's going to operate. He says, okay, Hobbes said that the individual operates out of a self-interest. He uses the term passion. So humans will operate out of passion, and reason is slave to the passion. Meaning you can't expect reason like, oh, we've set this up and it's reasonable or rational why this is what's being done. So again, silly illustration. To say it's rational or reasonable for me to have to go through some HR protections for our candidates, my passions to not do it will always override the reason of like part of my brain going, yeah, I get what you're saying, but I don't want to. And I'm just going to show up and try to get to do my job on the committee without having done it. Luckily, in case you're interested, we have protections, and I won't be allowed, which would be the right answer. So liberty, which is this passion, must be balanced by authority. Well, again, back to Hobbes' side of it. He's answered by Adam Smith, who you all know for more famous reasons, which I'll show you in a second, but that's not what you should know Smith for. Following everybody else, he's written about how do we understand the human. And so Smith is going to do his part. He actually worked both with Hutchinson and Cowan. And his kind of way of thinking about it is I want to try to marry these two guys together, which he does ultimately most famously in Wealth of Nations, which I'll show you in a second. But he's kind of trying to tie out there. He is accepting Hume's point that passion does govern the human. However, he lays in a factor related to community. In other words, that you also have a desire to be liked. And my desire to be liked or accepted, we might use that word instead of like, my desire to be accepted is that I will self-moderate my actions within you. So I have a good reputation at the college, I think, generally. And there's a lot of people who respect me. So I know this, so even though my passion is to not do the HR stuff, I'm going to do it anyway because I have a reputation I want to maintain, which is that I'll be on the committee and do a good job, and I won't be some ne'er-do-well that said, screw you, I'm not doing your training. They'd be like, Carl said that? Right? So I want to be received well by the community, so I'm going to step into that. And that's kind of where he's talking about this concept of the conscience. The conscience will help the human operate, again, know what they're saying, without any external power. There's no force being applied. It's an internal thing, as the way Smith's kind of reading it. And so then the government's got to be designed to stop anybody who harms happiness and at the same time maximize options for everybody who is working within the system. So now he's kind of picked lock back up. We do have some ne'er-do-wells. We do have to have that structure. Again, see him as trying to marry Hutchinson, who's saying that happiness can be enough, almost in league with Rousseau, although he's writing before Rousseau. And Cam, who's saying, no, we have to have some strict rules in a kind of Hobbesian kind of way. Smith's trying to find a way, looking at human nature, to marry those two things together as we're finding our best path forward. This, of course, then leads him to the idea of capitalism, which he writes about in this, we all know it as Wealth of Nations, but this long thing. Note the year it comes out. It's always kind of instructive for people that when we're constructing our system, I've even said we are bringing capitalism into the story, but technically I'm wrong because the word doesn't even come into existence until after we're done. But it is, again, that idea of the individual human getting to operate. And he kind of, we don't have time to really dig into this, but he kind of digs into what I just said to you. Now he goes beyond the idea of the happiness being a driving force along with your conscience into then the work that you do. So the work that you do should be something that you enjoy, brings you happiness, and you're doing it for whom? For the benefit of others. As you do it for the benefit of others, they're going to pay you, so you're going to get money to live, so you'll have food and drink and enjoyments, so you'll be happy, so you'll keep doing that thing. And that's the idea. And you have to always center capitalism in that same power pyramid of feudalism in which nobody got to do the thing they're good at. You did the thing your dad did, mostly. And if you're a woman, you got to do nothing. And nobody got to really operate in a system that's connected to, well, where are your strengths and where are your likes? And perhaps, what are you disinterested in, even if you're not sure you have any strengths? And so we tell our kids, you want to be a doctor, go be a doctor. You want to be a welder, go be a welder. Don't feel like one's wrong or good or bad. Go pursue that thing. You might find out you don't like it or you're not any good at it, in which case you shouldn't keep doing it. This idea of capitalism. Now, modern capitalism, 20th century, 21st century, all kinds of questions you can ask about what he's getting to. But nonetheless, that's the idea. Okay, so what? Right? Big deal. But I kind of tried to give it to you at the beginning. Here's the big so what. How do I say it well? For me. This is the story of our creation. The Americans created this system, and it seemed to basically, broadly, be working well, and yet now, when we looked at the stats and the data, and it's overwhelming, there's a whole other there's more stats to look at. It's horrible. So something's gone wrong. And then what's gone wrong is that somebody's done something to something, or were my expectations faulty in the first place? Did I expect something because I've been told about some arc to history, or that the Enlightenment is this champion of reason over and against the dogma of dark, blinded religiosity or other things? Was I lied to? Was I misled? And so we want to kind of dig into this in the last 30 minutes, kind of getting us to the place of what I hope will be continued insight relative to, well, what were these guys doing? What should we think about these things as you and I are alive now here in the 21st century in 2025? We finished the first quarter. I'm looking around the room. Almost all of you were here when we went from 19 to 20. So we remember how exciting that was, and can you believe it? That was 25 years ago. I was watching something that's got nothing to do with it. I was watching something the other day, a documentary, and they said, back in the good old days of the 1980s. Oh, it hurt my heart. I was just racking. I was like, oh, goodness, don't say that. 25 years in a snap, right? Now here we are in 2025. Well, what's going on besides maybe things falling apart? And again, I would just suggest be careful to not fall prey to the demonization or the accusatory stance of it's that person's fault. When you look at the history, you start seeing this is happening sort of along the way, long before that person got into power or did anything, and we kind of back up and go, well, wait, oh my goodness. And so now I'm way back here in the good old days of the 1980s or 1970s, and I realize the same problems were here, we just didn't see them maybe. Maybe we didn't talk about them enough. So what do we do with that? Well, first, this is the same slide I showed you before. Just want you to see it again. This is the implications that we have when you ask somebody. In fact, on the podcast, because the Enlightenment I felt deserved more depth, I did a bonus episode. So if you go to the website link and you look, there's a bonus episode on the Enlightenment itself, where I brought in another super smart expert. And that one, some of you appreciatively come and you're not offended by listening to my voice. The podcast is a lot of me talking with my partner, but it's more me than my partner. That one's the other way around. I've got this expert, I asked some leading questions. He shares a lot. So if you're interested about the Enlightenment, about its implications, even beyond this, I encourage you to go there. So again, the big ones are here, right? That because of all this, we've done these things, we can find these things like the scientists, we can find the laws of nature, and that will lead to continued improvement, consistent improvement, and then, good it'll constantly be moving. Again, we'll come back to, Dr. King, I promise. There's a good answer to explain his point. But in my opinion, been so often misused that there's this arc to history. Okay, well, is that even remotely true? Oh, here's the link again if you want to get to the podcast and if you want to find it. And I would say, and the podcast talks this way, that the evidence disproves these implications, says that is incorrect. So then now you and I are here, and we're in this setting where many of us may feel like you may not agree with me, but you may agree with me. Wow, we're adrift. We're kind of not sure where we're going. Well, I'd like to know where to go. Well, I'm not going to be able to tell you where to go, but we're going to look to see, can we understand better understandings? And the understandings of that comes for us because we need to have a good comprehension or correct comprehension of our historical events. When we have this, then you're in a position to use your reason, which as a champion of the Renaissance, I will tell you that you have. She can think. She can process. He can comprehend. That is fundamental to my first day of class. Ask any of my former students. I said, let me tell you my anthropology. Let me tell you my working thesis, and that is that each one of you have value. Each one of you can think. Each one of you can process. I believe in your innate ability. And that's not because I'm an Enlightenment person, because I usually don't like the Enlightenment. I'm a Renaissance man. That's the key. And the Renaissance gives us this. So I believe this, and that we want to kind of dig into this, and this is kind of why I've gone the journey that I've gone. And again, as we've said, what we're facing right now is a worldview tension in our country. The tension that we're fighting is a worldview tension. You might even accurately call it, a civil war. Because there is two worldviews at deep struggle within our country. And so one of the challenges for us
is the fact that there are some who take one part of what the founders said, the Enlightenment, and I would suggest misuse it or misunderstand it from its historical moorings. And there's others who take the Enlightenment and they all equally do the same. And they then have extrapolated out to solutions that are at odds with the founders. And for me, I always want to go back to what the founders give us. And can we kind of go there? By the way, just to be clear, if you from the podcast point of view in particular, I'm not approaching this in a triumphalistic kind of way that suggests that there was some golden age or some glory years of U.S. history in which we were perfect and it was wonderful and we should go back to the 1950s or the 18th. No. In a sense, there's not, but there's lessons for us in a generally positively constructed system from the late 18th century that worked well for a while. And we can examine those. And so again, we're looking here at the Enlightenment. And please understand, the Enlightenment deeply impacted what was happening in our colonial system. As I said a moment ago or earlier, you still have tens of thousands of immigrants who are coming to our country in those years of the 17th and 18th century. And some of them are coming because they recognize these ideas that they may have heard about from Voltaire or from Montesquieu are not in existence here. And so they come to us to live in that idea. Remember, the American dream is never about money. It's never about wealth. It's always about liberty. It's that I can come from where I am in some other part of the world and pursue the American dream, which is what? That I will have the freedom, the liberty as an individual to go for what I want to go for. That we have warped it in the 20th century to turn into money is part, again, evidence of why we have lost our way as a nation. So when you see these immigrants coming, they're not coming to make money. They're coming to have this freedom of opportunity that in their minds, our system, which balanced these two key things, including the Enlightenment, provided for them. And the Scottish Enlightenment was huge. Not only the names that I've given to you, of which most were all written, you have these two just as examples, William Tennant and John Witherspoon, who come to basically lead colleges in the Americas. Our literacy rate, even amongst women, was so high at the time. I don't think that there's an accurate reading to say who was first or not first. And I showed you on that slide earlier that currently we're 30th. Put that into context. When you look at these, if you go and Google it, literacy rates, the first 15 are all at 100%, and then it's 99s and 98s. Ours, depending on, I saw two different sites, and one has us at like 35th and we're at 86%, and one has us at 32nd and we're at 91%. 91% literacy, 86% literacy is not horrible. But one would think that as much money as we spend on education, and in a setting that is this Enlightenment-based system that we've had for 250 years, ours would also be 100%. So deeper conversation there. But if you'd gone back in time at this point, I would offer that those British citizens living in North America and then eventually American citizens, they were probably all literate, including the women, because of the value that they had. And then you can see again here, when you get down to the Second Continental Congress, the deep influence. The thing about Witherspoon is that Madison was one of his students. So when you think about Madison writing, remember at the time of the writing of the Constitution, John Adams is in England, so he's in London. So he's not able to lend his influence and his knowledge base into what was constructed in the Constitution, except by a few letters. He and Jefferson both were gone in the process. What's interesting, though, is along the way, somehow our revolution has been supplanted in the minds of people by the French Revolution. And we've done a French Revolution examination here. It's one of my favorite things to examine because I find it so instructive as to understanding the next 200 years of European history in particular. But I think it's useful to note that those two expressions are not, brother and sister. The American Revolution and the French Revolution were vastly different expressions. There's probably a lot to do with context, and that where we were coming from, as I've said before, for instance, we got a chance to practice government of the people for 150 years, kind of in our various colonies, whereas the French had 180 years, I think that's the correct number, 170, 180 years, where nobody got to participate in government outside of the power pyramid. So when they call the Estates General in the late 1780s, people are coming who are good, well-minded people, but they don't have this experience that we are able to bring to the table. Another way to put it is a lot of times people ask me, why were we so successful? And I'm like, bench strength. When you look at our bench, I mean, we have people, and particularly if you include women, we have people who are at the state level that you and I never hear of, who never got to go up to the top level. I was just reading a great book about the sisters of Abigail Adams. And one of the sisters marries somebody who Abigail considered, and John to some degree also considered, one of the most brilliant men living in and around Boston. And John kept asking him to take different posts in the new nascent revolutionary struggle and eventually governance, and he didn't want to, which is fine. But you're saying that the bench strength that we had of so much depth, it's an amazing aspect. And I would just point out that then if you track revolutions through the next 200 years, none of them look like ours. And they all look a lot more like France's, more bloody, more inequitous, more destructive. Well, that's not to demonize France or the French Revolution or the Enlightenment, but it is to raise questions of what might have been additional in our structure that was not present in the French structure. So one of the things we want to kind of look at is what does happen is there kind of emerges this new idea for the human, that somehow the human could create on her own worldview. Now we're still a long way off from what we call postmodernism, but this is kind of how we start to get there. And this comes back to that idea that maybe we can discover a morality that's hidden in the laws of nature, or if need be, we'll just kind of create our own. And this ties into then a viewpoint that begins to be constructed about the human. What is the human? I mentioned anthropology before. It's a core question that you could ask yourself, well, what's my anthropology? Like, what do I think? Because down the road the Enlightenment pointed, and then people after them kind of followed, you end up in this sort of an overly material world in which the human is nothing more than atoms put together through some long, millennium-long process to get to X point of view. And that's very different from what the vast majority of inhabitants on the society believed of a variety of different spiritualities, that the human was a created being and that the gods, he, she, it, they, had given some direction to the human to understand, and then that would kind of guide the process. So, as we kind of pointed out, I think, what we have found then is that the human and these laws of nature that kind of lead down that direction. Remember the slide I showed you earlier with some of the examples, like of air conditioner, combustion engine. There's some of the challenges that these advances have given us, even advances in medicine. You know, we have the opioid epidemic that we have right now because of attempts by pharmaceutical and medical people to eliminate pain, which is a laudable concept in theory. And there's more to say about that I could say, but the point is that we begin to go, well, wait a minute. Some of the laws that we found were incomplete. Some of them are just flat out wrong. So then if we think we're going to find a received morality that comes through our investigation, maybe that's not going to be helpful for us in the process. And then what we discover, if we do good history, is we start going, you know what? The species is largely unchanged. Particularly in terms of philosophy, world kind of an acting out. Like, how does the species act out in the process of a social interactions? And there's more than this that I could show you, but in general terms, you just end up in this place where you say, I was suggested too that the Enlightenment meant a human improvement, but when I get here, instead of being mad at my fellow, my neighbor, because that person's a jerk in my opinion, and somehow they missed the memo that we've all improved, I now recognize, well, wait a minute, that person's just like me, and we're the same as 5,000 years ago. I mean, are there some systemic changes? Yes. We don't draw and quarter people in laws of justice anymore, thankfully. We've, I think, most of the planet gotten away from beheading. So we'd say, yeah, that's an improvement. But I'm talking about in the internal sense of the human in ourselves as species. It is my argument, you do not have to agree with me, that we're actually the same. And so that then leads us to a problem. And it leads us to Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And we have to take time to get here. I'm going to go quickly, though, because we're running out of time. I knew I was afraid this was going to happen. You knew Nietzsche's name. Many of you probably have not read Kierkegaard or know Kierkegaard. But Kierkegaard's really the person who gives us this idea of existential. And of course, you understand, people talk about having an existential crisis. And that's been bandied around for the past several years. If so-and-so gets elected, it's an existential crisis to the system. Well, where does that come from? Well, that comes from Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche both are observing the world in this enlightened mentality that I'm suggesting is wrongly constructed. That says, oh, science is going to lead us to some human improvement. And what they both argue is, actually that's going to lead us into a place of internal crisis. They're, in one sense, anticipating what I've said led me in the past 15 years, in that I'm seeing my students feeling more greatly depressed or dealing with the internal emotional challenges. They started talking about it back in the 19th century. And so Kierkegaard's answer to that is to lean deeper into an individual spiritual faith that kind of provides you a mechanism to deal with the crisis. So he begins talking about this idea that the God concept is an absolute transcendent category. It's beyond category. Bruner will call that God is the holy, W-H-O-L-L-Y, the holy other. It's not of us, it's something different. And for Kierkegaard, for the person who kind of leans into this then, you can then find a way for your individual existence. You're kind of always becoming, and in the becoming, particularly as you relate to your fellow neighbor, you can kind of find yourself emerging into a deeper spirituality that gives you the faith to sustain through the changing society. Kierkegaard goes that way, Nietzsche goes a different way. They're both addressing the same question. And for Nietzsche, this is a great opportunity, because for Nietzsche, the Enlightenment has partnered with Christianity to doom us all. For Nietzsche, as he finds the human unchanged, he finds the human's condition to be because, one, the Enlightenment has lied to you that you could improve, or even that you could know something. And in some cases, too much knowledge being the kind of damning concept. And Christianity would give you the foolish belief that we're equal. I mean, when he writes God is dead, he's kind of aiming in at Christianity for its crazy ideas of each human having value. Nietzsche's like, no, they don't. There's a ranking of value, and what this leads to then is the clash or the opportunity of will for the individual to rise up and dominate. And for those who dominate over the chaos is a good opportunity for you to express yourself. And if you say, you and I go, but that's at the expense of the humans, Nietzsche goes, yes, right. And what's wrong with that? And this, of course, gets us to the very famous concept that you will know if you've studied your German history, particularly World War II history, when you get into what becomes the Nazi concept as expressed by their key thinkers at the time. That you are looking then to be freed from the slavery. Slavery to what? Slavery to the Enlightenment and slavery to Christianity or to religion more broadly. Both are chains upon you as an individual, and you need to rise above it. And so you do that in this great opportunity of the chaos of this kind of existential threat to yourself in your mind. Here's your chance to express your will and express your power. You become liberated and you rise over others. And if it hurts somebody along the way, you don't care, because it's not, he's very Hobbesian in this sense. It's not about your fellow man, because again, one of the ruinous, dumb ideas foisted on us by the Christians is that the humans are of value and or are equal. That they're not equal, and we're better off when we were in our pre-Christian world before that whole story happens. Okay? So, what does this give us? It gives us disconnected humans, humans who are struggling to find their way, humans who are trying to discover how can we go forward. We go forward by rejecting the idea that I have the capacity to self-select or that I don't need group. So when you're reading Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, in the year 2000, or you understand that 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, when the Surgeon General says we're having a crisis, a medical crisis of loneliness, you can see there is our problem, and what our solution is that kind of leaning in to each other, that I need one another to kind of make the story happen for myself. And then you realize, from my point of view, that you go back to how our founders had this kind of blended integration of, as Jefferson wrote it, the laws of nature, which we want to know, and we're glad that there are scientists and thinkers still pursuing the knowing, and we also want to understand and respect the side of, as he said, and nature's God. And this would suggest, perhaps self-serving as a professor, that we need more support for education. I remind you that both Jefferson and Adams, kind of our yin and yang of the founding of our country, both heavily supported education. Adams in the writing of the Massachusetts Constitution, Jefferson in the founding and starting the University of Virginia. They believed it necessary to promote an education, as we have seen in a couple other sessions, of a moral virtue foundation that allows us to operate in a civic structure with each other. And to some degree, then, that is me standing against any suggestion that sometimes is poised to us to suggest that the human is merely a commercial product, that the human is merely just a collection of atoms well, there's no worth in that to some degree. I just had this on here because this is the New York Times from January 10th. David Brooks writing. The things I'm saying, you go read it. David Brooks is saying the same thing, particularly the part about education. So let's wrap it up. I mentioned disillusion. I had a mentor teach me this, and I really appreciate it. We were having a walk and a talk, and I was moaning and complaining about something, which is my want. And he's like, "You're disillusioned." I said, "Yes, that's exactly it." And he goes, "Good." And I'm like, what a terrible thing to say. You're supposed to make me feel better. And then he broke it down. He says, "What's the word?" And I said, "Disillusion." He goes, "Work it out." I'm like, "Disillusioned." He goes, "Right." He said, "You're at the best possible place you could be right now because your frustration has led you to a place where you can leave the illusion. You need to be disillusioned and leave the illusion behind. But leave it behind for what?" Well, my suggestion, as I've already named, is to embrace then our historic anthropology that the Renaissance gave us and that our founders celebrated. I guess I would say it this way: our founders were not constructing a system based on the Enlightenment. They were constructing a system based on the Renaissance. And that idea of the Renaissance, where the human has value at the center of that concept, is vital for us to recapture. And in one sense, become re-enchanted with a new idea, which is really an old idea. It's their idea. And so let's close with showing you Dr. King, as I promised. Here's what he said, 1965, after all the brutality of the march in Salem. He gets to Montgomery, and in a very passionate speech, which you can Google and find online, about 45, 50 seconds, he repeats this idea, like, how long do we have to wait? Not long. And then he's trying to make the point that he's not necessarily suggesting that it's going to happen tomorrow, because he says the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Now, on its face, historically with data, the answer is no, it doesn't. It hasn't. That's not where we've moved as a society and as a species. And then I think, well, was Dr. King lying to me? Was he confused? And then I remember, what is he? He's a Christian pastor. And in that worldview, even if it's not one I respect or embrace myself, in that worldview, I realize what he's saying is the long arc will end up in a place where people like John Adams and George Washington both would tell us is a truism. It may be beyond our capacity as individual humans to ever make it come to full fruition, because it needs a power that is not our own, but that at the same time, if we think what the founders thought and we emphasize and kind of work to structure this moral virtue foundation, which has that blend of the laws of nature and nature's God, there's a path forward where I could, with God's power, find improvement in myself that then is moving along that arc that Dr. King was mentioning. And I think it's a good place to stop as we think about the impact, what the Enlightenment was, and its impact on our society. So thank you so much for being here. While you get a chance to look at what's coming up, are there any questions that someone would like to ask? Yes, sir?
Getting back to Rousseau and his conception of property being evil because it's tyranny. How specifically did Rousseau define property?
So the question is, Rousseau's point about property that I mentioned, how specifically did he define property? He doesn't define property. That's the problem. All right, that's where I always struggle with it myself. Because I jokingly will tell my students, when you're talking about Rousseau, we're talking about Marx, who's kind of down that same road. Does that mean we like basically all walk naked to a central place and pick up clothing for the day? It's not really clear. Are we all sleeping together? Well, we are probably all sleeping together in a large, open hangar, with you don't even have the same bed every day or the same pillow every day because it's nobody owns anything. It's just you walked in and which room, that kind of a thing. I don't know what he would say about clothing. He doesn't really get that narrow. And he is probably, to be fair to Rousseau, talking much more about physical property of land.